top of the table.
On the 24th of June 2022, US Supreme Court overturned the landmark Roe Vs Wade judgment, stripping the right of abortion from all its American women citizens. A judgment that protected the abortion rights of women for 50 long years. This now would give the state the right to ban or restrict abortions in 22 American states. What this means is that irrespective of whether you are a rape victim, a victim of incest, a teenager who suffered a pregnancy due to a burst condom, an expectant mother who finds out that the unborn fetus does not have the vital organs for survival, irrespective of all these situations, you may not be allowed to abort the pregnancy beyond 6 weeks. 6 weeks, which is actually the time one takes to even find out about the pregnancy. This also means 42% of Americans of childbearing age might end up suffering at the hands of the law. Former USA President Barack Obama too took to Twitter to express his displeasure on the judgment and said it was attacking the freedom of millions of Americans. While the debate is still on, what we also need to consider is the impact on the mental health of expectant mothers who might not be emotionally or physically prepared to birth a child. How would this decision impact their mental health? That's a topic of discussion today on Top of the Table. Hello and a very warm welcome to this podcast. I am your host Sheetal Sharma, and with me is our in-house clinical psychologist Jaswandi Sahasrabudhe. Hi Jaswandi.
Hi, Sheetal. You know what? I was so shocked to hear this verdict and coming from the American Court of Justice that there's no doubt that this has created a wave of despair for almost of most of the Americans.
Absolutely. And Jaswandi, I being in India now feels privileged today that I, as a woman, have the right to take a decision about my own body, which is so personal to me and something that would impact my entire life. I can't even begin to imagine what it must feel like to go through the entire pregnancy not wanting the child because of any of the reasons I stated in the beginning of the podcast. And you can't abort that pregnancy.
Yeah, Sheetal, and these days APA, which is American Psychological Association, has been doing and talking a lot about this verdict that has come out. And the recent study published by APA suggests that assessing abortion services, may increase symptoms not only of stress, anxiety, but also might take the mother or expecting mother to the trait of depression. And I would say that this also suggests that the inability to obtain any abortion increases the risk of domestic abuse. Like, for example, you imagine a lady who has gone through domestic abuse and still has to stay with the pregnancy because she cannot abort, and the strain that she has not only on her emotional or psychological concern, but also her overall well-being is so difficult to understand. Like, we have always been talking about trauma, and the trauma will be doubled, not because she has to be in an abusive relationship, but because she has to carry the child who is a result of this relationship. So the mother might not just develop depressive symptoms, but also, I feel, isolate herself from people, from her friends, from her family. And this can to certain extent also lead to self hatred, because when you don't look at yourself in a positive way when you stand in front of a mirror, there's a lot of hatred or negative emotions which can also turn into suicidal ideations. And we are just talking about mothers, but has anyone even thought about what will happen to the children? The children also will have to face the consequences of this unwanted pregnancy to a certain extent, because the parent might either neglect the child. So we have been talking about parenting a lot, and we know that the parent can either neglect the child or become overprotective, and both of it are extreme poles and can hamper the child's development to a greater extent. So I feel, Sheetal, this obviously will have consequence not just in case of mother's well-being, but also in case of the child.
Absolutely, Jaswandi. And it isn't limited to emotional stress, right? This can also turn into physical, financial, and relational stress, like you rightly mentioned. Now, imagine a rape victim who would want to get over that traumatic incident. But because of the inability to terminate the pregnancy, this person will have to live with that trauma for years to come. And no amount of EMDR sessions can actually help you overcome the trauma, because the child will always remind you of that incident.
So true, Sheetal. And Sheetal, there are studies that have found out that people who are denied abortions earlier are most likely to experience higher levels of anxiety, even lower satisfaction, and most importantly, lower self esteem. Because think about it, the mother or the female is always going to feel, I don't even have control over my child before he's born. Like, I do not have control over my own body, which is, if we look at our self-esteem, yes, the females are going to have a very negative effect on their self-esteem. And there is a possibility, that the clients or even the mothers will report anxiety and fear from watching their rights being eroded. As I was saying, if I feel that I cannot have a control over my body, I this will increase stress, which will obviously affect the physical health, because we know how stressful situations have been affecting our physical health. So if you see, Cheetal, this is just like a cycle, and it is not just affecting your mental health, but also but also it has a very negative effects on your physical health and well-being.
True, Jaswandi, and you spoke about anxiety, in expectant mothers. And, we recently created an in depth video on why expectant mothers are told to be happy. Now, we did a deep dive into the science bit of it, which was that if a mother is experiencing stress or anxiety, the placenta, instead of deactivating cortisol while entering it, lets some of it reach the baby, which in turn can get absorbed by the developing baby's neurons, thus causing long term emotional health problems like ADHD, anxiety, and also autism in some cases. So, you can imagine that unwanted pregnancy can lead you to stress or anxiety, thus, high possibility of birthing a child with these challenges, which eventually have more physical, emotional, and financial implications on the mother.
Yes, Sheetal, and like if we talk about psychological research, there are so many researches that have been conducted to, I would say, relate how prenatal stress or psychological health affects the child's developmental concerns. So, I would like to quote a study here. There's a study that was conducted on how maternal mood or psychological health affects the development of brain and its parts. So here the study spoke about how stress and anxiety during pregnancy can mean a higher risk of the child developing ADHD, depression, or any other neurodevelopmental concern. So during the study, basically they spoke about how parental or prenatal depression, okay, among mothers can affect the two major regions of brain, which is amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So I'll tell you what does this amygdala and prefrontal cortex do. Okay, so this amygdala basically is a part of the brain which is involved in regulating emotions, detecting and experiencing stress response, etc. On the other hand, the prefrontal cortex is involved in control of the behavior, speech, reasoning, logical reasoning, etc. So the idea is that even early on, babies of more depressed parent or mother have less of a connection in their brain between amygdala and prefrontal cortex, which obviously means that the child or the baby who is coming out is going to have less cognitive control over their emotions. So if you see, not just the prenatal condition is affecting the child's psychological health post birth, but also it is affecting the child's brain development to a certain extent.
Absolutely, Jaswandi, and that is what we had also spoken about, in this video, in this in-depth video. And I would urge our listeners to go and watch that video as well about pregnancy and why must pregnant women be happy. And honestly, Jaswandi, apart from this, irrespective of, once the child is born, I really shudder to think what psychological state that child would be in, because of, not receiving the kind of care and, love every child deserves. In a study which was published by Swedish scientists, which was published by NCBI. 120 children who were born due to refused abortions were studied, and it was found that a large number of them were placed in foster homes, removed by authorities from their home because of poor living conditions, since they came from economically weaker sections, and most of them required psychological intervention.
So, Sheetal, yes, I'm sure not only the mothers, but I can surely say that the child also gets affected due to the prenatal psychological concerns that the mother is facing. And as you rightly said, there is a possibility of increase in or even orphanages, because the child might be at a risk of developing so many behavioral concerns. Let's not just talk about ADHD, but also learning disability or also conduct disorder for that matter. Because Sheetal, we are only looking at the psychological condition, but because this is an unwanted pregnancy, there will be so many environmental triggers or factors that can affect the child's psychological needs to a greater extent. And not just this, because the parent or the mother prenatal health is was not at par with what it is supposed to be, the child might also develop some neurodevelopmental concerns like autism spectrum or also Williams syndrome, which is associated with deficits in the brain development. So, because of the distorted parenting style, or I would say environmental factors, prenatal environmental factors, the child may be later at risk of developing a lot of adolescence related concerns, or which includes development of anxiety, OCD, and a lot of personality disorders. So, all said and done, Sheetal, I'm sure that this verdict is for sure going to affect the child's health and not just the mother's health, because with all of these factors, with all of the environmental factors and the psychological factors taken into consideration, the mental health of mothers and the children are surely going to be affected.
Absolutely, Jaswandi. And to sum it up, I'll say that the decision of banning or restricting abortions do not only have an impact on the psychological health of the mother, but also the child who was at one point of time unwanted. Is the US government prepared to face a generation of kids who might be suffering psychologically? This is something that definitely they must, ponder about. Also, this might result in increasing the divide between the rich and the poor, because the poor might not have access to traveling to areas allowing abortions, thus resulting in forced birthing of the child, and therefore taking care of the child when maybe financially they might not be equipped, placing in an even more financial burden, emotional burden, and also psychological burden on the parents of the kids. So all these things, I think, need to be considered once again, and I think that each state needs to look at it very, very closely, that what is it that would be the consequence or the result of banning or restricting abortions. So thank you, Jaswandi, for all your important inputs, and thank you, listeners, for listening into us, and we will be back again with yet another exciting podcast the next time round.